Welcome to the LIS Connection. Today we're going to be talking about LDTs, or Laboratory Developed Tests. With us today we have a panel of experts that are going to discuss the recent activities with LDTs and the FDA. First, we have Jeffrey N. Gibbs, Esquire. Jeffrey is a director in the Washington, D.C. law firm of Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, P.C. Before entering private practice, he was an associate chief counsel for enforcement at the Food and Drug Administration. Jeff assists in vitro diagnostic companies with a variety of regulatory issues, including product approval, pre-submissions, appeals of FDA decisions, regulatory strategy, clinical studies, promotional and marketing programs, and post-market enforcement. Based on his extensive experience working with the industry on FDA issues, he provides efficient, practical, timely, and insightful guidance. He has worked with companies of all sizes, from global manufacturers to one-person startups. Recently, Jeff and his firm represented the Association for Molecular Pathology, or AMP, in the lawsuit challenging FDA's LDT regulation, and Jeff is one of the attorneys representing AMP in that lawsuit. Also with us today, we have two representatives from Lakeside Life Sciences, a full-service in vitro diagnostic clinical research organization that specializes in designing and managing analytical and clinical validations to ensure successful FDA submissions. W. Jeffrey Allard, PhD, founder and chief scientific officer, earned his PhD from Dartmouth College in biochemistry. Since obtaining his doctorate, Dr. Allard has brought 6 new-to-the-world diagnostic tests through the FDA, with 30-plus FDA clearances and approvals. He has launched 16 new products, and he has authored over 100 scientific papers and abstracts. Prior to moving to the consulting world, Jeff served as Director of Development for LIS Life Sciences, where he designed and implemented a product development system, designed multiple clinical and regulatory strategies for novel multiplex oncology tests, wrote clinical protocols for prospective research and pre-market approval submission trials, and designed a patient registry. He also served as Vice President and Chief Scientific Officer of Fujirebio Biodiagnostics, FDI. He directed the applied research, product development, clinical affairs, regulatory affairs, and process engineering departments. Prior to joining FDI in 2004, Dr. Allard previously held positions as Vice President of Clinical Research and Development for Immunicon Corporation, currently Veridex LLC, a division of Johnson & Johnson, where he designed and managed clinical trials that led to the worldwide introduction of cell search assay for measurement of circulating tumor cells. Dr. Allard designed 3 clinical trials that led to FDA clearance of CDC for prediction of overall survival and progression-free survival in patients with breast, colorectal, and prostate cancers. Dr. Allard is an inventor on 12 patents for novel technologies, including new tests for gynecologic cancers, circulating tumor cells, complex PSA for early detection of prostate cancer, and other diagnostic technologies. Also with us today is Paul Allard, RN, co-founder and chief executive officer of Lakeside. Paul is a registered nurse and a co-founder of Lakeside Science. He saw the need to bring patients back to the foreground of clinical research. He has a proven history of clinical site management, as well as a vision to bring academic centers and community centers together to further medical research. Paul manages all day-to-day operations of the company. Welcome, gentlemen, to the LIS Connection.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think for all intents and purposes, the discussion today will revolve around the recent ruling that the courts made in the case brought to the courts around the FDA regulation of LDTs by the Association of Molecular Pathology. But before we get to that, let's take a short trip back in history and make sure we all understand exactly what LDTs are, or laboratory developed tests, what they're used for, what they're supposed to be used for, and all the events that have led up to this court decision. So I think I'll start with Jeffrey Allard, who, as you could see from his introduction, has a wealth of knowledge and experience in this area. Jeff, could you give us a little background and definition of laboratory developed tests?
Yeah, it has a very fascinating history in our field. And in 1976, of course, when the Congress passed legislation giving FDA the authority to regulate laboratory testing, FDA looked around and they saw that there were many hospitals, particularly hospitals, that had tests that they had developed at the request of their physicians. Typically, a physician would come to the lab, say, "Look, if I could measure some particular factor in blood and urine, whatever, it would help me with a particular subset of my patients." So the laboratory would develop that test, and those tests were used locally. They were used only by the physicians practicing in that particular institution who had a direct relationship with the laboratory. And FDA saw that there were hundreds, probably thousands of such tests. And they felt at that time they had bigger fish to fry. That was not the time for FDA to try and regulate those types of tests. In those days, we called them home brew tests. We have a different terminology today. Well, as time progressed, larger commercial organizations, not hospitals, started offering these same kinds of tests and started receiving samples from across the country and providing results to physicians. FDA has, for a very long time, contended that they had the regulatory authority to regulate these kinds of tests, but continued to exercise what they called enforcement discretion. But they clearly wanted to regulate these tests. They stated publicly on several occasions that they felt they should be regulated. And after a long and checkered history, several years ago, they issued a final rule where they stated, "We will now be regulating laboratory developed tests." Shortly after that, of course, the lawsuits were brought by ACLA and AMP, and I think that now becomes territory that Jeff Gibbs has the expertise. But that's the history of laboratory developed tests. They started out as what FDA considered a fairly innocuous and benign entity that really didn't require regulation and oversight. They became something much larger and more important and medically important. FDA contended that they therefore should regulate these tests, but the laboratory industry pushed back, and ultimately, with the recent decision from the Texas court, was declared that FDA, in fact, does not have the authority to regulate these tests.
Right, which I'm hearing has been a bit of a surprise, as I think now in the community, the laboratory community, there is quite a bit of what's going to happen now, or what do we do now, or what does this all mean? Before we go there, Paul, it would be interesting to understand, since you work directly with laboratories and working to create assays and tests, what the response was prior to the lawsuit when the FDA came out with their guidance after so many years of threatening to, so to speak. It finally happened. What was your experience with the laboratories, and what sort of questions did you get around what they will need to do?
Yeah, I think this is something that came to all three of us in a lot of different ways. People had no idea what to do, really. I think after the Valid Act failed in Congress and we had those different conversations, I don't think anyone really anticipated FDA actually going down this road. But the general consensus was, I don't know what to do. What does FDA want? How do they expect me to do this? And the last thing that was a really big issue for a lot of labs was the cost. What they're what they understand is, a pharma trial that cost 100 million to $1 billion to run, they panicked and realized they couldn't do that. They didn't have the resources to run these kinds of clinical trials and clinical validations for FDA approval. So there was a lot of fear around it, and there was also a lot of fear about the testing that would be taken away from patients. A lot of tests are LDTs that patients rely on every day. So people are really worried about, losing the ability to run those tests. And we talk about them being, I think FDA's biggest concern was these really high complexity molecular tests, but most LDTs are not the super high complexity molecular type testing. It's a lot more rudimentary daily testing. So people were really worried that that would be taken out of patients' hands and didn't know what to do. And I think Jeff Gibbs got a lot of those calls of, what does this mean from a regulatory strategy perspective?
Right. Well, that's a good intro in welcoming uh, Jeff Gibbs, attorney. Jeff, everybody is probably been calling you. I'm assuming that know you that are in this industry, wondering what happened. What's the outcome and so forth. But before you share that with us, maybe you could give us a little insight as to why the American or the Association for Molecular Pathology, or AMP, as we all know them, why they came to you guys and what was the premise for the lawsuit?
Well, I think it's helpful to just go a little bit of history. As Jeff mentioned, 1976, Congress passed the medical device amendments. And for 16 years, FDA didn't really talk about LDTs, or as he noted, home brew. And then in 1992, FDA, in a passing reference in a draft guidance document, said that they had authority to regulate these homebrew tests. And that's when I first got involved, when we filed a citizen petition on behalf of a number of companies challenging FDA's authority to regulate LDTs. We said, you don't have the power. FDA 6 years later denied our request. The year before, they'd signaled that when they issued their analyte specific reagent, or ASR, rule. FDA should have listened to me, because they would have saved a lot of time and effort. Over the last 33 years, FDA and industry spent a huge amount of money, time, resources, mental power on this question of how FDA should regulate LDTs. And now, according to the judge in Texas, they don't have that power at all. But FDA, as Jeff mentioned, FDA looked at the changing landscape and saw that LDTs were playing, in FDA's view, a different role. And FDA viewed those as being bad. I mean, if FDA viewed it through a prism of negativity, rather than here are new tests, novel tests, important tests that can help patients. And I think that's a fundamental problem with the whole FDA approach, is they presumed LDTs on balance were negative. And you see that in the preamble to the proposed rule and final rule. FDA wanted to do this all through guidance document. During the first Trump administration, there was a memo from an attorney at HHS saying FDA would, if it had the power, would have to go through rulemaking. So FDA issued that final rule just enough time so that it would not be subject to congressional review. There's a provision that allows for Congress to overturn regulations if Congress acts within a certain number of days. This was issued long enough ago so that the new Congress could not do that. Hence the need for litigation. ACLA sued first, AMP sued second. We sued in different courts in Texas. The cases were consolidated in front of a single judge, and the judge issued his decision on March 31st. Why the lawsuit? Because it was imposing extraordinary burdens upon laboratories and laboratorians and on patients. The lawsuit was not just ACLA and AMP, but they're also joined in. It was a laboratory for ACLA, a doctor for AMP, who explained what this would mean to them and their ability to serve patients. And that's what it came down to. FDA viewed this as bad on balance, and ignoring all the important clinical outcomes and clinical results that come from these individualized tests, or what LDTs can accomplish. When FDA issued the rule, of course, there was a lot of distress among laboratories, but some laboratories acted differently. They began to work toward an assumption that on May 6th of this year, the rule will go into effect and phase one would take place. Others decided to wait and see. I mean, there are very varying reactions, but there's a lot of confusion, a lot of anxiety. And while phase one itself was not so draconian, the subsequent phases were. And any lab that wanted to get a 510K or de novo or PMA was going to have to start working on it very soon. And I think that's where the real costs were going to mount. So we wound up with a decision on March 31, which says that FDA does not have the power to regulate the laboratory developed test. End of game.
Right.
If it's right there at the judge's decision. Now, of course, it's not the end of the story, and I know we're going to talk about that. The court's decision is just another step in a 33-year saga.
Right. Right. And so I think what you're alluding to is there is the possibility of an appeal, I believe. And so what does that mean? And what's the timeline for that?
Right. The government could decide to appeal. It has 60 days from the day after the decision, which make it April 1, 60-day clock. The decision to appeal would have to be made by not FDA, but Department of Justice and the Solicitor General. If they appealed, it would be to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a very conservative court. So they do have the option of appealing. If they do not, then it's a final decision. And that would mean that the court has ruled and FDA did not appeal a decision which said FDA does not have the power to issue rules regarding laboratory developed tests. In other words, FDA could not get around the ruling by issuing some other rule. These are not devices according to the court. And therefore, because they are not devices, FDA could not regulate them. But that doesn't mean that Congress couldn't do something, or that FDA could try to regulate labs in an indirect manner. So even if FDA and the government do not appeal, I don't think it's the end of the question of what you should do about laboratories and laboratory developed tests.
Right. So Jeffrey Allard, let's go back to you now that we have a result and we're in this sort of 2-month waiting period to see if there will be an appeal, whether or not there is an appeal or not. Where do you suspect laboratories are today? And I'm sure a lot of them are asking, what should they do now? Or is it back to where we were before? Back to business as usual, no worries? Or should they be looking to do things differently?
Yeah, I think on the one hand, they're probably breathing a great sigh of relief in the sense that in the short term, at least, they're not going to be required to submit to FDA, as Jeff mentioned, that they would have been under the final rule as the phase 1, 2, 3, 4 were implemented by FDA. So that is now gone, and laboratories do, in fact, have the freedom to offer laboratory developed tests. But I think it also opens many new questions. The lawsuit only says FDA does not have the statutory authority to regulate laboratory developed tests. However, that does not take away all FDA regulatory power and authority. And the question now is, where does that authority end? And where does the laboratory and CMS regulation of laboratories begin? Questions like, and we can talk about this further too, but what is a laboratory developed test? FDA defined it in the past as a test that was developed by the laboratory in the laboratory. So what was not allowed was to purchase a kit from a manufacturer and a protocol that comes along with it, software that's already written, potentially an instrument, and to simply implement that in your laboratory and offer test results. That was not considered by FDA to be a laboratory developed test. It had to be your test that you developed. Well, where do we stand now? What is an LDT now? Are we still under the same rules that FDA would have enforced in the past, or does this ruling in some way liberalize any of that. One of the questions that was a gray area, and I think is going to be an even larger gray area, was the extremes for a laboratory developed test were clear. If you took reagents that you purchased from a scientific supply house, and you formatted those reagents into a test, and it was your recipe and your design, and you determined the pH and the timing and the reagents and all of the different conditions, that clearly was a laboratory developed test. If you bought a test kit from Abbott, Roche, Siemens and ran it on an automated instrument exactly as they told you how to run it, clearly that was not a laboratory developed test. But the question that was always an open question was, well, how far do you have to go to deconstruct that test before it becomes a laboratory developed test? Well, now where are we? If we weren't quite sure before where that line was drawn, where exactly is the line drawn now? And what about advertising, marketing, sales of these tests? To what extent will FDA continue to regulate that? To what extent will this liberalize and open up potential marketing opportunities that perhaps were not there before? Lots of questions are going to open up about, even though FDA may not regulate laboratory developed tests, they can still regulate off-label uses. They can still define what is a laboratory developed test. They can still say, no, you're not running a laboratory developed test, you're running a device under the law. How is all of that going to work? How aggressive will FDA become, or will they back away from these in the wake of this decision? You know, this was clearly a rebuke of FDA authority. Will they back away from some of their requirements? So I think it's, on the one hand, it's a great relief. Okay, yes, we're not going to have to go through FDA and spend millions of dollars and take years of our time in order to achieve approval or clearance of our tests. But I think it also opens up a whole new can of worms, and many different questions are now going to be exigent that we're now going to have to deal with.
Right. And through our discussions, Jeff, you had mentioned also the premise of manufacturing the kits or manufacturing the LDTs. And, you know, what does that look like, and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable? Maybe elaborate for the group a little bit about that part of the deal.
Yeah, I'd love to. I think this is a concern. You know, I think the LDT ruling, like many things, like everything that we deal with, it's a very mixed bag. On the one hand, yes, it gives laboratories the freedom to offer these tests. In many cases, these are novel tests, would be very difficult potentially to put through the FDA and may not appear and may not be available for patients without this kind of an avenue for laboratories to offer these tests. But I don't think this is going to come without some collateral damage. And one of those areas that I'm very concerned about is manufacturing. You read my biography. I managed, throughout my career, I managed research, clinical trials, product development, regulatory, but I also managed, in many cases, manufacturing technical support. And I can tell you that was probably the most difficult challenge in my career. Developing tests, commercializing tests, there's a bit of a roadmap there. It's never easy, but it's not the hardest thing in the world either. But when a test goes bad, when you have a test that's commercially being offered and it no longer meets specifications, problem solving, identifying, okay, where did the test go wrong? What component is not performing properly? And then finding a solution to that and implementing that solution. This is difficult. It's not particularly difficult for any scientist with the proper training to go into the laboratory and develop a test to measure something in blood and urine and cerebrospinal fluid, whatever, molecular test, immunoassay, chemistries. These are not so difficult to do. What is really difficult is that if that test is supposed to measure, if I've got a tube of blood and that tube of blood should measure a 10 in this test, it's not hard to measure a 10 today But what about next year and 5 years from now, as you're buying repeated batches of components and putting them together into this test? That is extremely challenging. Things change. Manufacturers change processes. They change their suppliers. Sometimes they tell you, sometimes they don't. And you all of a sudden find that your test can't meet specifications. A very difficult thing to do. I am certain and confident that larger entities, the larger commercial laboratories have that they have the infrastructure and the resources to hire the right people with the right experience who can do these kinds of things. But this is something that the large manufacturers struggle with. You can go to Abbott, Roche, Siemens, Biorad, you can go to any of the large diagnostic suppliers, and they will tell you horror stories of when their tests have gone bad. Can mom and pop, independent, small startups, small laboratories, can they truly manufacture accurately over a test that remains accurate over long periods of time? I think this is a real concern, and it was largely ignored in the battle over LDTs. And to me, it should have been a central issue, but it was not.
Right. And are there any regulatory or guidance in manufacturing LDTs? Is there any oversight in that in terms of, are they using RUOs that are not supposed to be used for clinical purposes, and who's overseeing that?
There is guidance, and I'll let Jeff give the deeper detail to this, the legal side, but there absolutely is guidance. There are two in particular. Jeff actually alluded to them, I think, just a moment ago. There is the RUO IUO guidelines, and that was born, just to give the history there, that guideline was born from a company that I actually worked for in a later stage that was offering tests. They labeled them research use only. They knew damn well that they were being used clinically, that they would sell the kits to a lab and the lab would potentially reformat somewhat or potentially just offer them exactly as is. And they knew this was going on, and the FDA came in and sent them a warning letter and actually signed a consent decree. And the company repeatedly said, oh, no, we won't do this anymore. And they did it anyway. And ultimately, FDA came in with a cease and desist order. And that ultimately led to the development of RUO, IUO guidelines. So there are guidelines that say research use only means that it's research. You're doing something that hasn't been, you're studying something that is today unknown. You're in unknown territory. You're doing animal research, or you're looking at a test perhaps that is already FDA cleared for diabetes. You now want to look at it in liver disease. Okay, fine. That's research. Go ahead. IUO is reserved for tests that are actually being used, investigational use only, for tests that are actually being used in clinical studies. So if you intend for this data to be shipped to the FDA to support a submission, that's a IUO application, fine. And then the second guidance is ASRs, analyte-specific reagents. This describes components that are now being used in laboratory developed tests. And I am assuming that that will remain in force, that FDA will still have the ability to regulate at that level. And they've made it clear that suppliers of ASRs, analyte-specific reagents, it is their responsibility to be sure that they're not deliberately selling something that's going to be used for a clinical test that is being used inappropriately. But in light of this decision, I'm not entirely sure how that's now going to apply. I think that's going to be another gray area that we're going to have to deal with. So there is some guidance, but I'm not sure that today that guidance is truly sufficient to guide laboratories through this process.
Right. So Jeff Gibbs, let's go back to you and follow up on this a little bit. What do you think is next?
Well, on the subject of laboratory quality, of course, laboratories are subject to CLIA, Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, which have detailed requirements involving laboratory performance of tests. In the court decision, the judge went on a great length to talk about CLIA and the requirements that apply to labs. So FDA tried to position this as we've got heavily regulated products that we review, and then we've got CLIA, which is hardly anything at all. We disagreed with what the judge said. I'm sorry, we disagreed with what the FDA said, and the judge sided with us, and the judge showed there are extensive requirements. Now, one could question the extent to which CMS, which enforces CLIA, has the tools to regulate, whether they have the staffing and personnel. That was, according to FDA, the case in the past, and one has to assume that's even more so under the current administration, given all the layoffs. But that, whether CMS is fully staffed and what their capabilities are is different from what the law says and what the statutory requirements are. One can make the same point about FDA right now as a result of layoffs, and what will FDA do from an enforcement perspective. So there is CLIA, which is a very robust, comprehensive regulatory scheme, not the same as FDA, but robust. And then there's also the accreditation for organizations like CAP. And some states have their own laboratory regulations as well, New York State being the one that is the most stringent. Then for labs, there's also the concern about complying with the obligations of the medical directors. They have their own personal obligations and obligations as doctors if they're MDs. And then the fear of product liability litigation. If they offer bad tests, that would be something for which they could be sued under state law. So this depiction of labs as being essentially unregulated is which FDA laid out in multiple documents, really is a gross overstatement. It's positioning labs in a way that it does not reflect accurately the level of regulation. Does that mean every LDT is going to be perfect? No, but nor is that true for every IVD that's sold by a commercial manufacturer. The fact that there's FDA regulation does not guarantee that every test will meet the specifications and provide accurate results. Where do we go from here? It's a great question. In the current administration, it's hard to imagine that there would be an increase in lab regulation. One could envision someone looking at this and saying, we really ought to take a focused look on labs. We ought to look at some of the higher risk tests, the ones that perhaps play a larger role, and you could define risk in different ways. And let's devote more resources to them and get a better idea of what is happening and do more inspections. I cannot envision that occurring over the next 4 years, but that's definitely something one could think about. One could also imagine legislation. One of the arguments that has been made by industry on the manufacturer side and by other advocates as well, not just manufacturers, is patients really don't care whether the test is an LDT or it's manufactured. What they care about is accurate results. And why would we have a system which has gone into two different directions? Kits regulated by one organization, laboratory developed tests regulated by another. Really, we should have a single uniform system to ensure that all results are accurate. That would require an act of Congress. Given that the House could barely decide on whether they really couldn't decide on whether they're to have proxy votes for moms who are nursing, that was a struggle. And they barely pass the must-pass legislation about taxes and budget. We still haven't gotten to the hard part yet. It's really, really, really difficult to imagine this Congress tackling something as complicated and divisive and something that requires as much thought and care and development as a ballot act or a ballot act successor. But that does remain something for the future. I mean, the court decision ends one route for regulating LDTs. It does not end the issue of what should be done as a matter of policy with diagnostic tests. And you can make a pretty compelling argument that the system we have here has worked well, but it probably could be improved. There are probably things that could be done to make it better. And that could include on the manufacturer side, having less burdensome requirements for manufacturers. And think about one reason why there's so many LDTs is that companies on the manufacturing side cannot afford to bring certain tests to market. The costs are too great. The changing tests to meet new demands or new data or new information are too high. They're just significant barriers to entry. And I find it fascinating that throughout this entire debate, FDA's focus has been the stick. Let's go after LDTs rather than the carrot. Let's come up with a more flexible system for manufacturers. Had FDA come up with a different approach, it may be that there would have been other kinds of tests that would have displaced LDTs. Well, we won't know because FDA never tried that approach.
Yeah,
Very interesting.
Stephen, I'd like to just amplify on Jeff's comment because I think that's a really important comment that he just made. And that is that while this court ruling may be hailed as limiting some FDA authority, it doesn't really address, and this is my opinion, this is not fact, but in my opinion, it doesn't address probably the more important underlying issue, which Jeff just nailed on the head, which is FDA overregulation. Over the years, I've been working with FDA since the mid 1990s, and things have evolved in some good ways, but not in some not so good ways, some harmful ways. They have evolved in good ways in that there is an increasing level of education, understanding, knowledge within experience within FDA. There are reviewers today that truly understand the technologies that they're dealing with. In the mid 1990s, FDA was often shooting in the dark. They didn't have the kind of training that you really would like them to have. And it's critical that they do understand that in a detailed way what they actually regulate. That's been a good change. But along with that, with this deeper understanding has come greater and greater and greater requirements and regulations. And they are now, in my opinion, largely over-regulating these tests. And I think that's the challenge that really lies in front of us in the future. VALID, the VALID Act, for those who are not aware, this was a congressional act, has a long history. It was proposed, it was never even brought to the floor for a vote in either the Senate or the House, but it would have overhauled Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and it would have simplified the pathway somewhat. There were still plenty of complications even with the VALID Act, but we need something like that. I would argue that the system of Class 1 exempt, although some are not exempt, and then there's Class 2, and there's 510Ks and de novos, and what really is the difference? And then there's Class 3s that are the highest level of regulation with a pre-market approval. All of the ins and outs and subtleties, this is a complicated system, and it doesn't have to be this complicated. And we don't need the level of regulation and requirement. There are some requirements that FDA has established that, in my opinion, are medically harmful. They're so stringent that they're in fact medically harmful. We need to streamline the process. As Jeff said, if FDA, and it's disappointing to me that FDA has never really joined in that process in a meaningful way. They could lead that process. They could be the ones working with Congress to explain, this is where we are today. Here's a better system. Help us to implement this. Now, whether that's gone on behind the scenes and we don't see it, I can't say, but I don't see evidence of that publicly, that FDA has embraced the concept of streamlining their requirements, simplifying their requirements, and reducing the burden. Congress requires least burdensome, but that's really kind of in name only. And I don't see a lot of least burdensome effort going on. So I think that's really the challenge for the future, more than just the question of laboratory developed tests. Let's streamline, simplify these requirements, lower the cost. Device manufacturers don't make the tens of billions of dollars on their products that the pharmaceutical industry makes. We're a nickel and dime industry compared to pharma. we need help. And I hope that in the future, somewhere down the road, FDA and Congress can offer that kind of help to simplify this situation. It can be made better, and it really needs to be made better.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
I think that in some ways, I know we're talking about LDTs, but LDTs are the subject of the webinar. But this, in a way, is a more important issue because the LDT debate is, from if the court's ruling stands, it's over. There'll be a lot of questions about what FDA can do and what should do. What should CMS do? What should Congress do? Those are questions that are actually much more productive from a policy standpoint. I mean, Jeff's absolutely right. For example, on least burdensome, lip service is the phrase that comes to mind. FDA will send out letters saying we consider the least burdensome approach, and it's not least burdensome. It never is least burdensome. It's a phrase that they use, but it doesn't mean anything. There's the system where you have 510K, you have class 1 products that are exempt, and some are not exempt from 510Ks. You have class 2s that are requiring 510Ks, and others are exempt. And then you have class 3s. And how do you decide which class it goes into? It's very hard to draw the line. And when we've looked at how FDA's regulated class of products within a single category, it's almost irrational. You would not have predicted the way that which ones would be de novos, which one would be 510Ks. Valid was not really the solution, in my view, because Valid would have been a great piece of legislation for lawyers. It was highly complicated. And Jeff, FDA did have a chance to chime in. They did provide technical amendments. It didn't simplify it. It just added more complexity and gave FDA more power. Valid would have made things much more, the goals were admirable, but the execution, in my view, left a lot to be lacking. And would have left years of debate over exactly how things were supposed to be done. I think that it really would be a good idea if people looked at this thoughtfully and said, okay, let's start all over. If we were designing a system today, what would we want? How should it be done? I realize that given everybody's perspective and everyone has their own views based on their own economic considerations and their relationship with patients and their needs, that academic medical centers will be different from smaller labs, from larger labs, from small manufacturers, from large manufacturers. But it would be an interesting policy exercise to see if there's something that could come up where people look at it and say, here's a system that makes more sense. And to me, one of the core principles, and this FDA has talked about, is benefit risk. I mean, if you look at the FDA guidance documents for de novo, 510K, PMA, that's a key factor. But it's not really applied in practice. When we have submissions, FDA gets down into the weeds and will look at details and will not ask the question in any kind of meaningful way, do the benefits of this product outweigh the risks? And I think because of that, that the failure to do so has made those applications much more costly and complicated and challenging. And I know about you, Jeff, Paul, whenever I work with a company and they get through, it's almost always just a sigh of relief. It's not something that gets through FDA smoothly and easily. It's a slog, even when it should be more straightforward. That no company I've worked with in recent years has just gracefully gone through, and FDA has had confined itself to a few technical questions and then granted a 510K or de novo. That's not the way it seems to work. There's a lot that could be done to improve the process overall. I do think one of the comment here. Valid was considered at a time when FDA's authority to regulate LDTs was very much up for debate. And laboratories that would have supported Valid were thinking, we have an alternative. We can either have Valid or we have FDA regulation. Well, now FDA does not have the ability, absent an appeal, to regulate without legislation. So the dynamic politically may change significantly because laboratories no longer have that fear that FDA will do something that's worse than what legislation would be. They know that FDA does not have the power. So I think that changes the bargaining chips for the two sides.
Yeah, I'd like to offer just another view on what could be done. I don't think it ever will, but
Hmm.
this, again, my opinion. I was very disappointed with the EU when they adopted the IVDR. And
Mhm.
the reason I was disappointed is that for decades, we had worked under the IVDD, in vitro diagnostic directive. And that directive required, it had all the requirements for a quality management system, which I think is very important. You need to have the system, you need to follow it. Manufacturing was regulated, all of the analytical studies, the accuracy side of tests was in fact regulated. You didn't have to submit and you didn't have to get approval from an authority in most cases. In some cases you did. But in most cases, you could simply offer your test and notify the country, the notified body in the country that you were going to be offering the test in. And that was in place for decades. And it did not require large, prospective, multi-million dollar clinical trials. And, there's been a lot of discussion on the internet in the wake of the LDT court ruling about clinical utility and clinical validity and how important this is. Well, it is important. I mean, obviously, a test has to have medical value. It has to inform a physician in a way that they will make an important medical decision. So that is clearly there. However, for decades in Europe, large, expensive clinical trials were not required. And I never read in the New York Times that people were dying in Europe because they didn't require these expensive clinical trials. I think their regulations were adequate. And instead of the FDA adopting a system like the IVDD, the reverse happened, and Europe adopted a system that was more modeled on the FDA. And I was very disappointed because I think it's just a matter of over-regulation. I think regulating analytical performance, accuracy of tests, consistency in manufacturing over time, quality management system, these are critical. These are important. If we're going to survive as an industry, we've got to do these things with our tests. You have to provide an accurate result. But, we should also give physicians some credit. These are pretty smart people. And if a test doesn't provide them with medical value, they're going to figure that out real quick. And you don't have to go spend millions of dollars. Most of these tests, if it's something completely new to the world that no one knows anything about, sure, you need to go out and do a prospective clinical trial in order to demonstrate that there is a medical value. We to use clinical utility and clinical validity, and we've sliced and diced this in all different ways. But whatever you call it, that has to be demonstrated, yes. But it doesn't have to be demonstrated over and over and over again. And this is what FDA requires. Every time we bring a COVID test through the FDA, we got to demonstrate that it has clinical value. Well, who the hell doesn't understand the clinical value of a COVID test? Why are we doing this? So I think that an IVDD like system that emphasizes analytical studies, accuracy, manufacturing consistency, quality management system, these are really critical. But we don't need the FDA system that requires large, expensive prospective trials unless it's a new to the world, unknown entity. Then, of course, that makes sense. Otherwise, we don't need to do the same things 75 times that we've already done before.
Jeff, I think you made some really important points. I just want to amplify a couple of things you said. One is, I think your experience here was replicated here. FDA asserted that there were safety problems with LDTs, and they did that in the proposed rule and the final rule, also in other documents. But when you look at the case studies that they cite, they're old, they're not very many, they're not very powerful, some are just wrong. So, the FDA's evidence for there being failures and shortcomings with LDTs really was very weak. The court did not have to get into that issue, as to whether FDA had accurately stated the case because it decided it on other grounds. But under the Administrative Procedure Act, FDA really had done a very poor job in making its argument. Conversely, on the benefit side, FDA had largely ignored the benefits of LDTs. And, the comments show that there are many very powerful and valid LDCs that provide a great clinical utility that would not be available if FDA acted. So, that's part of the framework. But even with those novel tests, and I think that this is one of the things that has really bothered me with FDA, who decides what level of performance is appropriate? If a doctor might think that 80% sensitivity for a certain condition is fine, that they're willing to miss that some cases because right now they can diagnose nobody. But an FDA reviewer can say, no, we think 80% sensitivity is too low, or the specificity is lower than we like at FDA, and so there'll be too much anxiety with people with false positives. Well, the patients may have a very different take. The patients may be willing to accept a higher rate of false positives in order to be told whether they have, in order to detect something that might kill them. But FDA makes that decision in a way that is very opaque. They'll say the sensitivity is too low. And I think that is something that FDA has never articulated, is how do they go about deciding how they make those cuts as to what level is appropriate. And for new tests in particular, I think that's a really important issue that FDA is just not faced up to. And I want to mention one thing about the law of unintended consequences. You talked about IUOs, RUOs, and ASRs before. So if you remember, I think you were talking about Centocor as the company that had lots and lots of IUOs and RUOs.
Maybe.
Maybe. But that's not a public record that they did sign a consent decree. And FDA came up with the idea of ASRs to address this because they wanted to have higher quality products instead of RUOs and IUOs, that laboratories would be working with ASRs, which are regulated in a much more robust way. And the ASR regulation was adopted. And then FDA narrowed its interpretation of what qualified as ASR. So laboratories were buying things from manufacturers who were producing ASRs that met the FDA regulations. And then under FDA's revised guidance, some of these products were no longer available as ASRs. So the manufacturers now called them RUO, IUO. The net effect was by making it more, by reducing the size of the ASR community, by narrowing what qualified as an ASR, FDA pushed products into RUO and IUO, which are not subject to the same manufacturing standards. And I thought that was a great example of an unintended consequence. FDA may have had very good motives and intentions in doing it the way it did, but it did not really anticipate what the reaction would be, which was, all right, if we can't call it an ASR, we'll sell them as RUO, IUO, and the result was the labs had products that were no longer subject to the same regulatory requirements. I think that that's one of the difficulties with what FDA was proposing with LDTs, that there are going to be hundreds of unintended consequences. If you don't like LDTs and say, well, we'll just regulate LDTs as devices, you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry with hundreds of thousands of tests that are being offered, and tens of thousands that are coming online. You have to think about what the consequences will be of that. And I don't think the FDA really ever grappled with all those consequences. So whatever regulatory regime you have, whatever you're working with, and you and I could come up with some idealistic ideas about what might be, but you do have to think about how companies will react and what might happen. There's not going to be a perfect scheme, but I do think that one could come up with something that's certainly a heck of a lot better than FDA's attempt to shoehorn all LDTs into the FDA regime right now. And I also think the FDA device regime could be significantly improved if people, worked on it in good faith and, looked at it as an appropriate way of balancing benefits and risk, encouraging innovation while ensuring an adequate level of regulation. There are trade-offs that will have to be made, and what trade-offs you're willing to accept may be value judgments. There'll be economic components. but at least be explicit about what those trade-offs are. With LDTs and the way FDA approached it, that was not the case. It wasn't trade-offs. It's just we're going to jam everything into a regulatory system. And I think that the court's decision in part reflected a concern about the way FDA was tackling this entire industry. The court was very clear that this was a large industry that was going to be undergoing revolutionary change if FDA's rule prevailed. So I know, Stephen, we're talking about a lot of different topics, but I think that in some ways we're at a crossroad, and the crossroad is, what do you do about diagnostic regulation? How should you regulate diagnostics? And we now have a perfect opportunity in the wake of the LDT decision to rethink it. I think this opportunity is going to be squandered because of other political issues and so much else going on in Washington. But it is an opportunity for thoughtful people to approach this in a thoughtful way.
I think that your insights have been extremely valuable for the laboratory community. Who knows where this is going to go? Maybe the two of you will get an opportunity to go to the Hill and talk about it and voice those opinions, or maybe someone at the FDA will catch this and take some of it to heart. I think now I'd like to go to Paul to kind of get his take and Lakeside's take on what to do next, and what will you be advising your clients to do here going forward with this ruling, and what might happen with an appeal or no appeal? How are you advising your clients?
Yeah, and I'd kind of like to address something that I think Jeff and Jeff were kind of walking around. We're in a world today that laboratory testing plays a much more fundamental role in healthcare delivery than it did previously. We have technology today. I met a researcher from MD Anderson who stood up in front of an entire conference and said, "I'm going to use a really big word." And she said, "I am curing cancer by utilizing genetic testing for targeted therapies." And they were all LDTs. And she gave a case study of a patient with pancreatic cancer who, with genetic testing and one round of a targeted therapy, was cancer-free. They went into remission and they had no return of the cancer for 8 years. So these tests today are playing a much greater role. They're identifying therapies for people. When we talk about the world of taking pharmaceuticals, what people are really tired of is taking drugs that don't work and getting side effects. Laboratory testing can now identify people who would respond to those therapies, and that's where a lot of this LDT work is going. And that's the message that I think gets lost in the regulatory discussion in a lot of cases. I think it's important to understand the regulatory landscape, um, and we have to know it to be able to put successful products on the market. But I think the overarching conversation is really laboratory testing should take on a much greater role than it is today within healthcare delivery. And I think, Jeff, and obviously I've been learning about this for my entire life from him, is that if you do good science and medicine, you're probably going to offer a good product. Now, Jeff and Jeff can sit down for about an hour and read through an IFU and a little bit of clinical trial data and tell you whether or not this is going to be a reasonable test, if it has some medical importance, if it has value. That knowledge within the industry doesn't really exist. Most people, who start a therapeutic, there's a very defined process by which you walk through to get through FDA. In our industry, it's different every time. And as Jeff, you said, it's just a slog to fight with FDA now. And I think LDTs have this really good opening to do good analytical testing, put in place a quality management system. If you have an ISO 13485 certification, you're meeting a high quality bar. That's a great place to start. That it doesn't cost $1 million. It doesn't take, years and years to do, but it's a really good certification that shows you meet a high bar of quality and then go through the appropriate analytical testing to show that this thing is reproducible, it's accurate. Um, and you'll account for a lot of the issues that Jeff Allard raised with, the manufacturing concerns. If you go through New York State, you might as well be getting FDA approval. Their bar is very high. It's very difficult to get New York State approvals. But if you do that, again, you're going to offer a really powerful and meaningful test. And I've been reading a lot of comments on LinkedIn, and people have been saying, the main thing is now, what do we do to offer the most appropriate testing to patients? Because laboratory testing, it's just better. It's more effective than it once was. And making sure that you have a quality bar and making sure that you routinely adhere to that and then running the appropriate analytical validation studies. There are lots of people out there who can walk you through that process. CLSI does a good job. That's a very important aspect to it and just a very simple place to start. I'm sure Jeff have things that they would elaborate on that. Because, I mean, I'll be really honest, for our manufacturers coming to us to design a strategy, to do a pre-sub, to go through all analytical validations, clinical trials, and FDA submission, they're paying us between $4 and $7 million. And
Yeah.
it's taking anywhere between 2 and 5 years. Um, and everyone comes to me and they say, well, how long and how much? And I say, this is what it usually costs. But as you said, Jeff, the second you submit, FDA is not going to come back with a couple of, technical questions and walk you through it. They're going to lambaste everything that you've given them, and it could increase the cost exponentially. So I think LDTs have a good place right now to lead testing, but I think the message has to be how valuable to patients they really are, and start with a very basic framework, as you and Jeff both described, of what's your quality system look like and what does your analytical validation look like?
It's really interesting what you say about the patient and the value of LDTs. In the complaints that were filed by ACL and AMP, those were front and center. They were a key part of the lawsuit, the actual complaint that initiated the lawsuit. And there were declarations submitted by both parties that highlighted the critical role that LDTs play, and that in the absence of LDTs, patient outcomes would be worse. When you got to the briefs that were submitted, that largely disappeared. There are page constraints, and the court was much more focused on the law. And the fundamental issue that court ruled on was, are these devices? Now, underlying that, I'm sure the judge did read the affidavits and declarations that were submitted and the complaints that talked about health and safety and how patients would have died but for these tests. But when it came to the decision, that's not really that's not a core element of what the court talked about. And it's a shame in a way, because it's at the heart of it, the heart of it should be what's good for the patient. But because it's a lawsuit, the battleground was really focused on, in 1976, did Congress give FDA the authority to regulate LDTs, which is a very dry technical statutory term. And if you read the decision carefully, you'll see references to dictionaries and dictionary citations and abstruse legal analyses that have nothing whatsoever to do with the patient with pancreatic cancer. So that all gets overshadowed.
It does. And I think, I think you made an interesting comment. Patients don't care about who regulates it, they care about good results. I'd go even further to say most patients don't even understand the value of laboratory testing to their care. They don't understand that it really even exists outside of, thyroid hormone, a complete blood count, those kinds of things. But when I talk to people and I say, look, our medications are about 30% effective in general. That's about the average, 30 to 50%. But there are tests that can identify whether or not you'll respond to those therapies. Patients go, holy crap, why can't I get one of these?
Mm,
Where do I go to get this? They don't even know how special laboratory testing
mm,
be and how this can come from the labs. And your point is very well taken, Jeff. You know, when it comes down to it, and you're in a courtroom, you need to make a legal case and you need to make it strong. I think for Congress to act, there needs to be some level of understanding of how important it is to patients and what it means to
mhm.
cancer. I think it was 2018 when, you know, it was announced that death rates for cancer were dropping somewhere in there, 2017, 2018, 2019. I don't know. They didn't really discuss, obviously, treatment, early diagnosis was a big part of that, but they didn't really outline what I think would have been a huge contributing factor, which is laboratory testing and how much more advanced
Mhm.
it is today. And I think if we can combine, you know, the knowledge and the depth and the background that you and Jeff bring to the statement of, you know, hey, this is equally, if not more important than the massive amount of pharmaceuticals that are being thrown around. We could have a much more powerful message in general, especially, you know, again, not to bring it political, but under an administration that really hates big pharma. And I think this is an answer to a lot of the questions in big pharma that could be really helpful. And there might actually be an opening and an opportunity here to for that message to be heard a little more effectively. But that's just my opinion and my hope.
One of the big open questions as a result of the lawsuit, by the way, is what happens to companion diagnostics that are LDTs? You know, for the pharma companies that go to FDA and want the companion diagnostic or CDX, and it's an LDT, does FDA even have the authority to review a CDX anymore that is an LDT? Because it's not a device. So this is something that has never been discussed, as far as I know, prior to the decision by the court, because it was all very theoretical. It's not theoretical now. Yeah, but can FDA review a device without, if it's review a product which is not a device in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health? And the answer may be no. So where does that leave pharma? Where does that leave the Centers for Drugs and Biologics when they review applications and they want a companion diagnostics? I don't pretend to have the answer to how that will be handled, but it's a brand new question that is just one of the many questions that we're going to have to face as a result of the court decision, assuming it's not appealed successfully.
Yeah, I think I think that's a good place to leave it. We're just about out of time. I want to thank the three of you, Paul, Jeff, and Jeff, for participating in our podcast and educating and updating the laboratory community. What you brought today was just spectacular in terms of the current most up-to-date information around LDTs, what's happening. I think the community is starving for this information, and you really brought us some good information. I know there's still a lot of questions to be answered, a lot of things that need to still happen in this cause, and we certainly hope we can invite you back once we get a little further down the path and we hear from the FDA and so forth to have another discussion. With that, we're going to wrap up the podcast today. I want to thank again Paul Allard, Jeffrey Allard from Lakeside Life Science, and Jeffrey Gibbs, attorney, for all of their insight and opinions about where to go with LDTs. I'm Steve Hurwitz with Orchard Software, and thank you for listening to the LIS Connection.